All right, so this is the second in a three-part series. The first part was about good passwords. This part is about multi-factor authentication and different options surrounding that. And then the final class is about secure browsing, and different ways to keep yourself safe in that sort of atmosphere. So, who are we?
I'm Jonathan Bradley. I'm Head of Studios and Innovative Technologies here at the University Library.
And I'm Kayla McNabb. I'm Head of Instructional Content Design for the University Libraries. And we are teaching this series in conjunction with our Digital Literacies Initiative here at the library. So, Sure. So the benefits of multi-factor authentication are that hackers have to get past not one, but many authentication devices. If implemented correctly, such authentication devices would fail in different ways before security is seriously compromised. So we're trying to put more obstacles between a hacker and your information, your data, your accounts. And this is part of a report that the RAND Homeland Security and Defense Center published about the adoption of multi-factor authentication a few years ago. So these are the things that we're going to go through today. We're going to start by thinking about assessing your needs in this context. We're going to define multi-factor authentication a little bit, talk about how it impacts social engineering, and then, how different authentication types act differently when some are more useful than others. We're going to talk specifically a little bit about phishing attacks and kind of how multi-factor authentication helps you avoid being phished. And then there are a few kind of related topics to multi-factor authentication, things that you run into around the same time you would be signing in or submitting something online that we thought would be useful to talk about in this context. And then where do you go from here? What are the next steps that you would want to take with the information that you learned today? All of the slides are at this bit.ly, and it's going to be in the corner throughout all of the slides as well. So if you, and they'll continue to be at this bit.ly. So if you want to return to this, you can. A recording of today's workshop will also be available after the workshop. So if you want to return to any of these topics, you can there as well. So we introduced this sliding scale in our passwords workshop. Kind of things that are maybe not as critical, and things that are more key, something like your allrecipes.com account, maybe having a password only, not having two-factor authentication, not a big deal. But as you get closer to government secrets, you definitely want a password and some sort of second factor, at least one, to be able to help limit who can access that information.
And most of your stuff's going to fall somewhere in the middle here. But this is sort of the most protected things versus like the things we could.
So considering that sliding scale. And there are definitely things that may kind of change in importance over the course of, or over the life of the account, or things that you may not feel are as important now, but later you may decide you want to lock down a little bit more. So can keep that in mind as well. So what is multi-factor authentication?
So multi-factor authentication is a way of authenticating, by its definition, multi parts to it. So a password is a thing that you know. And a thing that you know is not actually a good way to secure something, because the thing that you know can be found out by something else, someone else. What multi-factor authentication does is introduces something else about you. In most situations, it's a thing you have, in the case of maybe your cell phone or a physical YubiKey or something along those lines. Or multi-factor authentication can also be a thing that you are. So this would be biometrics, your fingerprint, your iris scan, facial recognition, things along those lines. These have a tendency to be a little bit better authentication methods, especially when combined with something that you know, because they're much harder for someone to get a hold of. To get something that you have, they have to physically take it from you. To get something that you are, they have to have a piece of you, or at least be in physical contact with you, in order to copy or in some way realistically mimic that which you want, which is quite difficult and adds a level of hurdles to hackers. I tell people, like, being in security and like thinking about your internet security is very much it's that old saying, like, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun everybody else. You just have to make yourself a more difficult target than other people, and chances are, unless you have something very valuable, hackers are going to go after them first. You're too much work, and they're there for the largest number of people and the easiest get that they can.
So why should we use multi-factor authentication? So like Jonathan just talked about, a thing that you know is easy for someone else to know. In the Good Passwords workshop, we talked a lot about making sure your passwords are complex, making sure you use different passwords in different places, using things like a password manager. All of that's going to help somebody not know this thing that you know, but it's not foolproof. Then the thing that you have being much harder to get. So a physical YubiKey is specifically, if you complete all 3 parts of this workshop series, and then you complete a survey for us, then you can get a free YubiKey. And that is much harder for someone to get. They would have to physically take this from me in order to use it as my second factor. And then the thing that you are is nearly impossible. We'll get into some of the current concerns and ways that people talk about getting around biometrics when we talk about that as a second factor here in a few minutes, but it is nearly impossible at this point in order for someone to easily be able to use that to circumvent your authentication. So the important thing is anything is better than nothing, right? So having a crappy password is bad. Having a better password is better. Having a better password plus some sort of second factor, even if it's an SMS message to your phone, is better than nothing. So the further we can help people move down the scale, we feel like we're doing our job.
You're getting a little bit faster than all competition.
Yeah, you are getting a little closer to outrunning that bear. So prevent social engineering. We're going to dig into social engineering specifically here in a moment. But having something that isn't just that password that's easy for someone to find out really does benefit you from this perspective. And you don't have to be particularly smart or tech literate to end up with social engineering impacting you.
It could not even be your fault.
Yeah.
You might be doing everything right.
Yeah. So we're going to dig into that next.
Yes. So what is social engineering? Bring up the definition. Using social instead of technical means to access someone's data, account, or property. This include manipulation, deception, and intimidation. This is usually people trying to trick you into giving them information. Sometimes it's you, but not always. Sometimes they try to trick other people into giving you giving hackers your there.
So why should you care?
So if someone calls up Amazon and says, "Oh, I'm this person. I'm having a problem. I can't get into my account. I really need to reset my password." They play it up just right, and there's a great video of a woman, like, she plays a crying baby in the background as she does this, and she's like, "Oh, my baby will start crying." And, just really hams it up for this person on the phone, and they just immediately are like, "Yeah, sure, we'll reset this password and send it to your email account." Even if they are able to do that sort of social engineering and bypass some of the things that you've done, if you have set two-factor authentication, then you're still going to be protected, because just getting your password is not going to be enough to get in. They're still going to expect that you have whatever your second authentication is in order to log in. And in most cases, it's not possible for the person on the phone to give out the second for the account. Even if that person's sort of trying to social engineer them and they get the password reset or something like that, they're not necessarily going to be able to get into your account because you have multi-factor authentication applied to it.
Yeah. So Just one more thing to help in case somebody messes up in the system, and it may not be you.
And this happens more than you would expect.
Yeah.
Sadly.
So a little bit of a rundown of the authentication types we're going to cover. So we've got, first is code-based tokens. So printed backup tokens, we're going to talk about text message tokens and authentication apps. So a few different ways that you could get a code that you can put in to be that second factor. And we're also going to talk about physical tokens. So that's like the YubiKey that I showed just a moment ago. And then we're going to talk about biometrics and the different types of biometrics and how those are and aren't being implemented and kind of where we are with that as a, I guess, as a society. So code-based tokens. Kind of the bare minimum that you could do is have printed backup tokens. This is not something that we would say you should rely on, right? This is a backup.
Literally in the name.
Right. It does require secure storage, right? So you'd want to keep it in a safe place, ideally under lock and key where people don't know about it. All that kind of with like passwords printed out. You get 10 passwords printed out and they'll each work once and that's it. If you tried one again and it does work, that's a problem. And you should tell the company and consider whether or not you want to continue to have an account with them. Text message tokens are, at this point, we would say really don't rely on these for important accounts. And the big issue here is that social engineering that Jonathan was talking about a moment ago. So multiple cell phone companies have run into the issue of folks calling and then having cell phone service transferred to a new SIM card in order to intercept text message tokens for accounts like Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, things like that. So,
This was happening to famous people a lot for a while there. People were calling in and being like, I'm an assistant to, Matthew McConaughey. And he lost his phone on a flight. We need to get his SIM. I have a new phone here. Let's go ahead and transfer it over. And they do that. They get an SMS over from it, and then they log in and control it. And it's most phone companies are real bad at this. And they're not really seemingly getting any better as of recent. So the SMS tokens are, if it's important or you're in any way, shape, or form a target, I would rely on. They can get stolen pretty easily.
Yeah, and with this as one of the options for two-factor authentication, I think at this point it's really important to think about that phone number as kind of another password, right? So you want to be careful where you put that phone number. There are some accounts where text message token is the only option for two-factor, and like we said, better than nothing. But still, you want to be really thoughtful about where you put your password, or where you put your passwords, definitely, where you put your cell phone number, if that's the one you're going to use for two-factor authentication. And these time out if they're not used. So if you aren't able to get to it, then you're going to have to get a new one SIM. So it can be onerous in that way as well. So, our authentication apps. There's multiple authentication apps. There are ones from Google and Microsoft, and Virginia Tech uses Duo. These are the best option of the code-based options.
And then the app will generate a code that's good for 30 seconds on your phone that you'll use whenever you log in. That code and the previous one and the next one, what she was mentioning, are valid, and that's to account for differences in what time server your phone's using versus what time server their server's using, all that sort of stuff. They're pretty good. Those codes are still susceptible to phishing attacks, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. You can also use authentication apps like what the university uses, which is like Duo, and do like push notifications or phone calls. The Duo app is actually probably even a little bit better than the code-based ones because you don't input anything into the website generally, it will pick it up in a sort of secure transmission method. The physical phone call version is not the best, because then you have to physically secure a telephone, make sure it's never accessible by anybody else and stuff like that. But the sort of default push app thing is not bad. And you can also use that app with things like physical tokens to add even more levels of security. So Virginia Tech did do a pretty good job of trying to balance security with convenience. Probably chose ultimately was the best option out of that, which is good. They made a pretty good decision there. They didn't choose the best of the security, but they probably chose the one that's most convenient for the vast majority of people on campus, while still being a good secure option.
Yeah. Like Jonathan mentioned, a lot of times these can be secured with a physical token. So there are some apps like Authy and the YubiKey generator apps. Both if you have like NFC on your phone, you can touch an NFC physical token to them in order to get access.
The YubiKey, there's a YubiKey app that functions in the same fashion as like the Google Authenticator, except you can actually store normally the cryptographic sort of hash that it generates is stored on your phone. You can actually store it on the physical key itself. So if somebody did actually get access to your phone, which can be fairly common, then they still wouldn't be able to actually generate your codes. And they have to have both the phone and the key in order to get into it. So it adds even another level of security by, because there is actually these things don't look like much, which is actually part of their impressiveness. There's actually storage on it here, and it's not that much, but it can store things like keys and whatnot.
So all code-based tokens are vulnerable to phishing attacks, like Jonathan mentioned, and that's what we're going to dive into next. So why are they vulnerable to phishing attacks? Because a phishing attack is a system, or is an attack, an attempted access where the attacker sets up a page, typically that looks like a service that you intend to use. Then you go to log in using your username and password, and then they pass that to the real site. Then they get a request for a code, they pass it back to you, and then you put in your code. So you've given them everything they need to log in, and they have access to your account immediately because they're doing it in real time. So it's within, if it's a generated code, then it's within the time that code typically would be valid.
There's actually a library on GitHub where you can just set this up automatically. Just set up a server, it'll do this password, it'll do the passing of everything back and forth for you. And then just sort of drops off the user. I think it tells them there's some sort of error or something logging in, but then it doesn't matter because at that point in time the hacker already got access to your account. So always want to be paying attention to the URLs very closely. Most people who try phishing attacks attempt to get URLs that are similar to the ones that they are trying to trick you into, and so it may be that they slightly misspell it, or they use symbols, or becoming more common, they do a thing where they'll do like something.com, and then there'll be stuff after it as part of the URL, but then actually at the end of all that is the true, what we call top level domain, which would be like .com or .org or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so you generally, like, especially if you're on like your phone or something, it's usually going to concatenate and only show you the very first portion of this, and so you're just going to see like ebay.com and miss the rest of that URL, so you have to do that.
Yes, and don't rely on the green lock icon. Secure certificates.
Yeah, it used to be that secure certificates, getting one was you had to pay a lot of money for it, and you basically had to work with a company who would come verify who you are as a business and what you were doing, and sort of do this security background. There were different levels. There's the basic level was ensuring that you owned the domain that you were claiming you owned, and that you weren't trying to mislead people. That's no longer the case. You can automatically generate these security certificates, and so you don't really have. They still allow for encrypted transmission, but they don't necessarily say this person is trustworthy, which used to be sort of an implied part of using or of having one of those certificates. That's no longer the case.
If anything looks weird on the site, don't log in, right? So with that, kind of connected to that, don't log in through links that you were given. So especially if you get to a site and something looks off, if you have a bookmark, or if you have, a place where you typically access it through that's trusted, go back to that, Google it and look for type in just the base URL and go from there to the login page or the sign in. If anything looks off, just don't trust it. Especially via email, folks will see a URL and the link doesn't actually go to where the URL says, right? So making sure that you, especially if you can, do like hover over or look at that URL before you click on it, definitely.
I mean, in general, like Facebook is very common for this. People get emails. The email looks exactly like every other email they've got on Facebook. And even if they check, it might even say it's from the same place where they get their other Facebook. It's easy to spoof any kind of email address. It's just if you have an email that came in and it's somehow saying you should log into a site, just go directly to that site. Either go to Google and search for it if you know the URL, like Facebook, type in facebook.com into your browser. It's generally better not to log into things that you followed links from other sources, because you never know. People can make very convincing. I mean, it's very easy to copy exactly what a page or an email looks like and how it's functionally appears. So, I mean, that's very low bar for someone who's trying to deceive you, is to make it look like what it's actually supposed to.
And one thing that we talked about in the passwords class that we like to mention here is if you're using something like a password manager that has the domain, has the URL saved, then it's not going to prompt you to input your password, your username and password on a page that is not the actual URL on which it was saved. So that can be another check. If you end up on this page and you're not getting prompted to input your information, then something is off.
It's a good opportunity to sort of, hey, I should look more closely at this page.
Yeah. So what might this kind of attack look like? So like social engineering, they can be directed at you specifically via email or phone. A lot of particularly older folks who aren't as maybe technology literate are targeted more on the phone with phishing attacks. But
not just old people. I got a phone call one time.
That's true. Yeah, not just older people. True. But people who are less tech savvy probably aren't in as many places to get targeted via email. But it definitely happens both. And you should not provide any of your data about any of your accounts unless you initiated the contact. So that's just a good blanket rule to avoid phishing.
Like, even if they call and they seem to know about you and your account, it's still much safer to just say, okay, like, if this is truly important, then I'm going to hang up and I'm going to call you back before I tell you anything beyond this. And as a note, a follow-up to that, don't let them give you the phone number to call. Go look up from a place that you know is a valid source for the actual phone number that they're calling in. Because people often don't think about what if their information is public record. People think things like their name and their last name, their address, and all this sort of stuff, like, oh, somebody would have to know me to know those things. Nobody has to know anything about you. They can go look those up in public records. Your address, who lives there, who owns the place, all that sort of stuff can be easily gotten on most government websites. And a lot of things people think are private information really aren't. And so a lot of times, and that's how a lot of the older people get caught up in some of these things, but even younger people, they'll get a call and somebody will be like, yeah, like, this is your insurance company, and they'll say your right insurance company, and they'll say, you know, we're here calling you about this. And so you immediately think, well, they knew I was their customer, so it must be my insurance company, when they just found that out. And that's sort of what they rely on, is and you can sort of, it's a good time that you can tell that it's sketchy, is if you do tell them, well, I think I'm going to hang up and I'm going to call back, if they try to stop.
They try to keep you on.
Most places will, they understand, like, especially if they work for an industry where they do protected information, that this is something that people are being told to do.
Mhm.
And so if they try to stop you, that's a little bit sketchy.
They may try to give you a case number or something to follow up.
A case number is
But,
fine,
yeah.
because if it is fake and you call your real one, they'll be like, we don't have your
Right.
case number.
Yeah.
But if they try to give you the phone number, the
Right.
callback, then that is sketchy, and you shouldn't use that phone number. You should definitely go look up the actual one online. But otherwise, if they try to stop you and say, "Oh, you don't need to do that," or "Oh, this is a limited time thing," then they try to pressure you very much. And I think that's one of the things you have. I don't know if it's here next, but
no. But the last one is about whether or not the connection is secure, right? So you don't want to provide any sensitive information over a chat box or via email if it's not within a secure system. Like if you have to log into their site in order to send them a secure message, that's something different than them just sending it to your Gmail account or your university account. You don't want to send anything that might be considered sensitive information if the method of delivery is not secure.
Yeah. Mail servers on the back end are the part that people don't see. They're easy to hijack, and they're also, when they come in, they're not secure. It's not nobody uses email who does like actual security work for sending those sorts of secrets. And most people think, oh, well, they would have to have access to my account. Not necessarily. If they were to get into an email server, they just have all your stuff, various things like that.
So with that in mind, multi-factor versus phishing. Do you want to talk about the Google example?
Yeah, so Google implemented a physical two-factor login across for their company employees. And Google's employees are very high-profile targets. There are a lot of people who would love to have access to as much of Google's stuff as possible. They had 85,000 employees at that time. And once they started this as a mandatory policy, in the 2 years since they had started measuring this, they have not had a single person be successfully phished. And they have a chart, and their employees were getting phished a lot, which is another marker that people don't think about. Just because you know tech things does not mean you're immune to this whatsoever. It is a different thing to learn. It's a different way to think about it, and to a certain degree, it's a little bit of an inconvenience, especially if you do tech work. So tech people are very much still vulnerable to this sort of thing. But it's supposed to be a testament to the effectiveness of the physical token and what they're capable of.
So that's what we're going to talk about now. So currently a physical token is your best option for that second factor in a multi-factor authentication setup. They're not vulnerable to phishing attacks.
They're not vulnerable to phishing attacks because phishing attacks rely on putting a fake site between you and the real site. The way one of the physical tokens works is it encrypts your authentication information. And part of the way it does it is it will include the URL that it is currently trying to log into as part of its encryption. So if you are trying to log into your Google account and somebody feeds you a fake page and it's google.com-something.com, it's going to encode that into its encryption that it sends back. If your hacker, the person who set this up, then passes that on to Google, that authentication is going to fail because the hash algorithm is going to be wrong. It's going to have hashed out and created something that no longer matches what Google has on their side when you originally set up the key. So that's why phishing attacks don't really work against the physical keys because of the way they function.
So one thing to keep in mind with physical tokens is that they should be bought directly from the company. So if you go through and you purchase from a reseller like Amazon, particularly with Amazon, all of the stock that is supposedly a specific thing is typically mixed together. So you could have counterfeit YubiKeys mixed in with authentic ones, and then you don't know what you're getting.
That applies to everything. Everything is mixed stock.
Yeah.
to a certain degree, that means you can't really trust much of what you get from Amazon, but especially if you're thinking of something that is security based, when it comes to sort of the true manufacturing process behind some of this stuff, where a lot of the copies are coming out of China, and many of them have been proven to be compromised in various ways.
Right. So counterfeit or compromised could be that it's just not what you expect it to be. It's not going to give you that level of security. It's not doing the right type of checks, that sort of thing. Or it could be that it has some sort of malicious software that it's going to put on your computer, or it's going to track your keystrokes, something like that. There are a lot of possibilities there. And if you are switching to a physical token as your second factor, you should ensure that you have a backup in case of physical loss, because that happens sometimes. So
or physically destroyed.
Yeah.
These things are very tough. They're surprisingly tough. I mean, they just look like a little piece of plastic, but like there's a thing you can go online where they can like smash tests, and they're actually very resilient. But I mean, you could still destroy them.
Yeah. So the backup could be something like the backup codes. You could also have a secondary key that you have as a backup that you keep at home or in a lockbox somewhere that's safe. But you want to have something just in case something happens to that primary physical token that you're maybe carrying around with you all the time. So some examples. So YubiKey from Yubico is the one that we've been talking about, and the one that you get for free if you complete all three of the workshops.
They are definitely the industry leader and considered the most trustworthy option. They are made in Sweden. I always forget if it's Sweden or Switzerland. It's one of those European countries that values privacy very much. And they are manufactured very much openly, and they're very involved in the process of like creating the standard for making these sorts of keys. And they're more expensive, but that's sort of, you're paying for the trust and the mainstream leader called the Google Titan. It was a little bit controversial when it came out because it came with a additional little key fob that had Bluetooth capability on it. YubiKey had stated in an earlier sort of press release that they did not consider in their studies and their testing Bluetooth was an inherently insecure transmission method, which I have a tendency to agree with. And Google said it's secure enough for this purpose, and YubiKey disagreed. So there was a little bit of controversy going back and forth between them, but Google released their Titan anyways. That one is, do you trust Google with your authentication stuff? And that's sort of a question to figure out. And we do talk about companies and their trustworthiness and secure browsing thing. But there's also the Thetis Fido from Thetis. They're I think fairly new on the scene. I haven't heard much about them, but they have a fairly good reputation.
Yeah, they're one of the top rated at this point, not above YubiKey, but they're typically on your top list.
Those. Google has traditionally worked with YubiKey on the They worked on the standards for doing the authentication and stuff, and they're now manufacturing their newest key with YubiKey as a partnership. So I'm hoping they gave up on the whole Bluetooth thing and moved on with their lives. There is also potentially your phone.
Maybe.
So Google has projects. They claim it works, and last I heard they weren't ready for mass production or mass release of it.
Yeah.
But they basically turn your phone. There's like an app they'll put on it that'll make it function in the same way that a YubiKey functions. So sort of cryptographically programming and doing this sort of work. If it works, that's great, because most people have their phone anyways, and if it functions right, it shouldn't be susceptible to somebody steal your phone the same way like SMS messages are. So possibly in the future, you may just be able to do this with your phone. You wouldn't even need a separate physical key. But I sort of like the idea of having them separate, because I feel like if I was a target, more of a target than I am, my phone would be something that if someone was really like, I'm targeting that person, they would think I need to get their phone. And to a certain degree, they're right. There's a lot of stuff on there. If they could get into that, that would give them a lot of things, but having the key separate means then they now have to steal two things, which might not be any harder than stealing one thing depending on the context, but
yeah.
It does add an extra level of, well, now I have to get this.
Just making it more onerous for someone to take things from you. So, and all of these are links. So if you go to the slides later, you can follow all those to more information about these examples. So biometrics, the future.
So biometrics are they sort of have that promise of like, this is what you are. People can't steal this. This is going to be the ultimate in authentication and stuff. And it's fairly new. I mean, and so whether or not you can trust it is hard to say. It's sort of a case-by-case basis. If they're not implemented correctly, they can be vulnerable to phishing attacks if people don't sort of do what YubiKey does and incorporate the URL of the site into some sort of algorithm as they are creating these encryption hashes and sending them off. Which they stole from Microsoft's Face Login. Now Google has Face Login on their main phones, but there's a very clear differentiation about how these are implemented. Like Microsoft does it fairly well. Apple does it fairly well. Google had a lot of controversy about their implementation. It's much faster than the other two, but it doesn't require that your eyes are open. And so, and Apple's does. And so people were saying, well, that means someone could do it while you were asleep or against your will. You're being bound and held, or police officers no longer need your consent to unlock your phone. And so is it a good means of authentication if you don't have to have your eyes open anymore? And so it's as simple as this. Like back in the day when Microsoft first announced their logins for their computers with facial recognition, someone immediately found out you just hold up a picture of the person and it would log them in. It's supposedly better now. You got to sort of move a little bit so it can tell that you're a three-dimensional object and not just a two-dimensional photo. But there's a lot of that you know, whether or not any particular implementation is actually secure, you sort of got to judge them all on what they're doing and putting together. That being said, they're not really as insecure as the media makes them out to be. Every time somebody releases some sort of biometric login, there's always like a news article within the next couple of weeks that's like, researchers crack the new fingerprint sensor on the iPhone in like 2 days. But if you go read the article, it's like the researchers made a plastic mold of someone's finger and cast it in fake skin. And I was like, well, okay, how are you gonna? That requires physically like having someone make. That's not a reasonable way of like breaking into it. It's not like you just put your finger on there a bunch of times and it opens up. So there's a lot of grandizing, and the problem is like security researchers are working from the perspective of security researchers. So they're like, this person holds government secrets. Can this authentication method be broken? And so any yes to that is something they have to report about. The news media does not care whether or not this is an actual practical way of breaking this or not, and the sort of thing that 99.9% of people should ever be worried about. So you hear a lot of reports about how insecure some of the biometrics are. It's not necessarily true. It's a lot of talk that's not really relevant to the everyday person. It's really only relevant to someone who works for DARPA or something like that.
So we've talked about a few examples so far. Fingerprint scanners are becoming really ubiquitous at this point, getting into your phone or your tablet or your laptop. Iris scanning seemed like that was going to be like the thing if you look at any movies from like the 90s and late 80s. But it's really hasn't been implemented kind of at large. It's still more niche. And its implementation and face recognition has been implemented in more places, but like Jonathan talked about, there are several different approaches to how that's done, and how well it's being done and under what circumstances really varies.
The last thing I read about iris scanning, part of the problem was like the resolution of getting the iris scan to begin with. And either you have to do something really high resolution, which usually means like putting something right up to your eye, or you have a low resolution scan, in which case it's easy to have false positives.
Yeah.
So they're sort of like, is this really a better way of doing it? So most people are focusing on facial recognition because it's a little bit You don't have to show something up into your face in order to have it work.
Right. Or the fingerprint scanner.
Or
Well, like here now you can scan your hand to like check out in the dining hall. Do you know that? Yeah, you can. Just like run it through this little thing. So yeah, so there are definitely places where these biometric tokens are kind of starting to touch different aspects of our lives, but it's still like on your phone, you still want to have a PIN or a pattern or something that's more complicated. You still want to have other ways to protect it.
There's also, I don't think it's in our slide, but we talked about adding it. There's also where you are as an addition to like who you are, something about you, something you have. There's also where you're at. There's GPS authentication. It's multi-factor in that you still have to have some other authentication method to prove who you are. But it also will say, well, you can't log in unless you're in a certain location where you verify this against GPS. Those are a lot less common.
Or you're attached to a specific like IP address.
Or you're attached to it.
Yeah.
Doing IP addresses is a terrible way to go about it, but because IP addresses are extremely easy to do. But like GPS locating is pretty good. It just depends on how accurate you need to be. Campus region of a login, but they're not going to know you're in your office. And part of that's just the way GPS works, being on indoors and stuff like that. But it is a thing that can add another level if you're interested in that.
Yeah. So not multi-factor, but still useful. So a few things kind of related to some of these topics. So one-time passwords. It's an alternative to traditional passwords. Typically, some of the major examples that we kind of think about is Slack. So sometimes when you're logging into Slack, you can say, send me a magic link, and it will send you a link, and that's what it's going to use instead of a password. So it's not a second factor of authentication really, but it requires you to do something with something that you have. So if they're sending you that password via email, you want that email address to be very well secured, of course, and they're counting on that to be secure. So the example, Slack, also
Namecheap does Namecheap. Well. Namecheap is a domain name service registrar, which is more of a concern if those accounts get stolen than something like Slack.
Right.
Yeah, they can do it with an app, but they can also do it through email. I don't have their app, but they still send me a one-time password. And I'm like, I've got a good password.
Don't need to do this.
Just let me use my actual password. But these generally are not a second factor; they're just a single factor for logging. And in the world, they solve the problem of people who use 4 passwords. But then still, if you're relying on the original password as a possible authentication method, then they're still using 4 passwords. Then it could still be hacked by someone just figuring out their 4 password line again. So they're trying to pitch this convenience thing, which sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
Yep. So another thing that kind of comes up around these conversations, but isn't really directly related to authentication, is more related to submissions and making sure that bots are not submitting things. So typically you'll see this if you're submitting a form of some sort, or if you're uploading something. They are really there to figure out if you're a bot or not. And they're becoming less and less obvious with new iterations. So in the past, you're typing in those wavy letters and numbers and symbols, then you're clicking on all the stop signs. Now, based on the way that your mouse moves around the page and the things that you select, they're deciding whether or not you're actually a person. So,
well, it's partially that. It's also partially where you've been. It looks at your browsing history by cookies and things like that. And that's why if you're in like an incognito browser, you'll always get the captchas whenever you try to fill out a form. But it looks at your cookies and your browsing history and says you browse like a bot. I'm going to ask you to do this. And if you aren't using like an incognito window or something like that, then a lot of times you won't ever see the tests at all. And that's the goal, is that if it can tell you're not a bot just by looking at something like that, why even show you the CAPTCHA at all? And so we're on CAPTCHA version 3.0, I think, at this point, and Google's been very tight-lipped about what they changed from 2.0, because 2.0 wasn't out that long. 1.0 was out for a very long time.
Mhm.
And they're in a constant race against hackers and bots, because the reason the 1.0 basically was considered inept was because people figured out that you could just send these to people and pay them, like in third world countries, and pay them basically 5 cents for reading this thing back, and then just pass it to them immediately, pass it back, and drop it in, and their bot would have access to the thing. And so those traditional capture methods weren't working, and then same thing sort of happened with the click on these stop signs and stuff like that. And so now Google is trying to say, well, what's a thing that we can judge the actual history? It's not a question that could be passed off to an actual human. It's something about the person or the thing that's working on, that's functioning, that's acting in this way, that we can judge. And so they're trying not to tell how they're doing that, because they don't immediately, the moment somebody knows how it works, they're going to try to figure out how to get by it.
So not multi-factor, but useful. So, questions about anything that we talked about, or any issues that you've run into that we didn't address? An attendee asked, what do you think about police or other authorities compelling biometric scans to access devices, such as face scans or the use of fingerprints?
That is a concern, and that is partially why. So some phone manufacturers know these concerns, and in their newest version, Google has a lockdown mode that is on, like you hit the side button on your phone and it pops up on the menu, and it's one of like your restart power. It's right there. You hit it and it will, like, it goes to whatever the most difficult form of authentication is, and that is the only way to unlock, to combat that sort of thing, because people are just realizing that, yes, the police can just touch your phone to your finger while you're handcuffed or whatever, and there's not really anything you can do about it, or they can hold it up to your face. And that is a concern. If you are worried about police surveillance and police brutality, biometrics are essentially, at the point in which you are bound and arrested, they have what you are. They have your irises, they can hold your eye open, they have your fingerprints, they can hold something up to your fingers, they can scan something on your face. They have that form of authentication. And if that is the only form of authentication that you have for a particular way of getting into a system, then they have access to that. And so phones often rely on biometrics because it's faster than typing in a password or something along those lines. My phone is still secured with password. I do have a fingerprint sensor on it, and I use it for some authentication stuff, but my backup is a long, like, complicated password. And every now and then I have to type that in, especially if I restart it or install a new app or something along those lines. That is definitely a concern, and we talk a little bit about the police and access, and where you put your secrets, and how much you trust the people. We talk about it a little bit in the secure browsing. We also talk about the passwords one. One of the things that is particularly good about certain password managers is they have no way of accessing that. Which on one degree is, people are like, what if they get real worried about that, and they're like, what if I lose my password or forget it or whatever, and I can't get in my account? You can reset it, you can still go through that method, but the people on the other end can't. They have no way of getting into it. And this has been proven for some of them. Like LastPass has been hit with multiple subpoenas from police officers, and they've legally been able to respond, we cannot provide this information because it's not possible for us to do so. Same thing with VPN providers and things like that. They've got similar subpoena requests from law enforcement officers from around the world, and have been unable to provide that. If you are concerned about it, which I think most people should be at least mildly concerned, if not reasonably concerned, depending on your circumstances, there are certain services you can go with, and there are certain authentication methods that you can use to further protect yourself from that sort of abuse of power. In my opinion, it is an abuse of power. You have Fifth Amendment laws against incriminating yourself.
Well, and I think it's important to think about that spectrum that we talked about before, right? Like if your fingerprint is your secondary method of authentication, then ideally that first one is going to be something like a password that you have the right to not tell. But if you are in a situation like you're under arrest, then you would want to be able to say, well, I'm gonna turn my phone off, and the way you get into it is this long password, and I'm the only one that knows it, and you can't open it. So I think really thinking about what those risks are is very important. And in the world that we live in today, where there's nobody who's really exempt from those kind of concerns. So I think that that's really, it's important to think about too.
Yeah, because I mean, there's a fairly well acknowledged and documented police tactic called phishing, where they'll ask, they'll come knocking on your door. They'll seem very friendly. They'll ask if they can come in, and the moment you say yes, even if you didn't think, and even if you didn't really actually do anything that you should be worried about, they'll come in and start looking for something to arrest you on. Anything, even if it's relevant to their case or not. Just because an arrest made is an arrest made in their book, and also it's a reason for them to continue looking for other things or try to apply guilt because you're guilty of this other thing. And so they fish, and they fish legally, and not always, but
well, yeah,
sometimes within the bounds of the law. Like if you say yes, you can enter my house, even if you've done nothing wrong, they still legally can look for things that are anything that's breaking the law, whether it's the thing they're actually supposed to be investigating or not. And so, like, being mindful of those things as like, we talk about phishing attacks from hackers, but that's not truly the only source there.
Right. And one thing that we bring up in the secure browsing workshop, the next workshop, but we haven't talked about yet, and I've been thinking about where I want to integrate it throughout these the next time we teach them, is relational security. So, and relational safety. So even if you think, well, the information that's on my phone or on my laptop isn't like incriminating for me, it's not going to possibly put me in any danger, but could it possibly put anybody that you've contacted in any danger? Is there any way that this information could be used against somebody else? And making sure that you're kind of thinking through that, because that could be a lot of different things. That could be a legal problem, but it could also just be someone who lives their life in a way that their family doesn't agree with or something, right? It could be a lot of different things. So kind of keeping anybody that you've had contact with in mind when you make those decisions as well is important. Yeah. So I'm going to move on to next steps, but if you have more questions, we can definitely hang around a bit after. So what we would recommend, next steps after this, if you don't have two-factor authentication on your accounts, set up some two-factor authentication. Anything is better than nothing. Just keep saying that to yourself. Identify accounts that need more secure second factors. So particularly things like bank accounts, your BT account is worth a lot to a lot of people, and that you may not think about.
People are very bad at judging the value of their accounts. I've known people who work in IT, like, I don't do my banking online, so I don't really worry about my accounts. And I've told them, well, you do know your BT account alone could go for hundreds of thousands of dollars in the black market. And they're like, why? And I'm like, because the library buys you access to millions of dollars worth of journal articles and journals and books, and that is not something other people have access to. So at this moment they can get your account, they'll download as much as they can. We have to ban accounts all the time, and we go talk to the students. It's usually a student. They usually got their account compromised because they shared the passwords or something they shouldn't have done, and somebody got it. And honestly, a lot of it's coming out of China, but it's not only out of China. And we got to ban the account, and we have to basically have a remediation between them and Central IT before they can have their account back. And people don't think about that. They think, oh, it's my BT account. I don't get a paycheck or something from them or whatever, so it's not worried about it. It's a lot of things you don't think about that are actually valuable that account. And you can't always think about the account the same way a hacker might think about the account, what they can get from it.
Yeah. So definitely top tier kind of things, anything that has money in it, right? Anything that can be used to access those other accounts. So if you have a primary email that isn't VT based, definitely making sure that that is as kind of secure as possible using however many factors you are allowed to use. Next thing, look at businesses that you have accounts with to see if they have a history of being susceptible to social engineering. So like we mentioned, particularly cell phone providers, but also banks, credit card companies. There are quite a few that have a history of being susceptible to these things, and keeping that in mind, right? So those are definitely, if you are really, dedicated to being a customer of that bank, but it has this history, then you want to make sure you have multiple factors set up to kind of stem those sort of things. And then come to the other workshops to get your free YubiKey, or buy one yourself. So secure browsing, we're doing the 7th and the 11th are the 2 for secure browsing. We don't have any more dates this semester for the passwords, but we will be doing at least could come to reading day. That's true. Well, that, I mean, yeah, they could. We should put that up on the library's page. Through the Professional Development Network in Telos, we're doing the full set of 3 back to back to back on reading day. So you can definitely do that. The secure browsing, like we talked about, we get into.
Or you could just come to 1 or 2 of them.
Right, you don't have. Well, I mean,
stay for the one.
Right, you don't have to, but you could if you wanted to. The secure browsing, you can sign up the same place you did for this one, calendar.lib.bt.edu. That's also where we will post any future workshops, and we try to get those up early each semester, as early as possible.
Yeah,
so
something else we should probably add to this next steps that we just thought of is, if you do have multi-factor authentication on accounts, and you have multiple types, like getting rid of your weak links. So like my Google account had probably 5 forms of available to me. It had an app, it had push notifications on my phone because I had a Google phone, it had backup passwords, it had SMS text messages. These were all available to me. And the trick is, any of those, like even if you're like, I primarily use my YubiKey, which is what I do for those, any of those are potential possibilities. Mm-hmm. And if any of those are insecure, you should get rid of them. And that's what I ended up having to go do to my account, was take off the SMS messaging, take off the code authentication, because I was using the YubiKey. I kept backup passwords as an option, but trying to get those off of there, because someone can just as easily say, use a different method. And then they don't have to go through your hardest method. They can go through the easy one that's convenient.
So there are links to a few different resources at the end of the presentation. So some information about social engineering, just a little bit more of a deep dive into that, avoiding social engineering and phishing attacks. Some different ways to detect phishing emails with examples. Some of those are really, really helpful, I think. Because they are much better than they used to be. Like some of them are quite compelling, and so it pays to be really mindful of that. Google put together a test for spotting phishing, so you can test yourself, see if you can spot the real things. And then there's some information about that transition that they had, where they were able to have their employees' phishing risks neutralized. And then the last link there is to compare those different types of 2-factor authentication hardware keys, to be able to look at kind of the benefits of the different types. Even just within YubiKey, there are like half a dozen different kind of variations. Some have NFC, some don't. Some are USB Type A, USB Type C, Lightning. So
about whatever sort of plug.
Lots of different choices there. So yeah, so feel free to look at any of those after today as well.
Do you have any other questions?